So I had this idea of expanding my photography skills and going into film and making documentaries. So I thought it would be fun to make documentaries about postcards. Maybe find the spot where they took the picture and do a then and now picture of the postcard. And then I flipped them over on the back and I thought, I could probably figure out who sent the postcard and who received it. That'd be kind of fun too. So I found 3 postcards. I went on YouTube and I made 3 episodes. And I showed them to my wife and my kids and my coworkers, and they said, "That's pretty clever. I'd keep watching that." So here we go. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Brian Zellmer. I've been competing in the Wisconsin State Fair for the past 11 years and thought it would be kind of fun to do documentaries about postcards. Not only am I going to try to find the bridge, the lighthouse, and the sign on the front, I thought it would be kind of fun to do a little genealogy research and find who the people are on the back. I hope you can spend some time with me on my next 3-part series. Welcome to the Postcard Pilgrim. Hey, welcome back. I got the truck all packed and ready to go. But before we go any further, let's ask the good Lord for some help. Dear Lord, please continue to bless the show. May it continue to give you honor. Lord, if it is your will, please help this show and this series and my whole program to go viral, but not because of anything that I'm doing, but because of you and the miracles you've done for me. Lord, this we ask and thank you for. In Jesus' name, amen. Our next postcard was written by a Lena to her mother, Mrs. James Richmond.
Dear Mom, won't be making it as my cold got worse. I'll write soon. Elsie is waiting for this. Love, Lena. Mrs. James Richmond, Pequot Lakes, Minnesota.
How cool is that? I can't wait to see where God leads me on this one. I've heard that name Richmond before, but I just can't remember where I've heard it. Let's collect our clues that were left for us on the back of the postcard. The first clue is a handwritten date of 11/3/64. That date is verified by the Grand Marais postmark on the same day, Tuesday, November 3rd, 1964. The next stamp we see is Pequot Lakes, November 3rd, 1964. That's pretty interesting to me because the postcard was mailed and received on the same day. That's pretty amazing. The writer of the postcard, I believe, is a Lena. If you look at the way it's written, looks like an L and an E kind of combined, an N and an A. In this postcard, we have 2 recipients. The first being Mrs. James Richmond, who the postcard is addressed to in Pequot Lakes. And the second person is an Elsie. For some reason, it was urgent for Elsie to receive this postcard because she was waiting for it. I don't know how far away Grand Marais post office is from Pequot Lakes, but it's almost like Lena wrote the postcard, had it stamped in Grand Marais, and then she mailed it at Pequot Lakes, so there was no delay in the postage. It just seems kind of odd to me that a postcard was mailed in the PM, maybe noon on a Tuesday, and then it was received in the PM maybe 3 or 4 hours later at the second post office. That's just kind of odd. I give a lot of credit to anyone that works at the post office. I don't know, maybe Lena prayed to God for a postal miracle that the postcard would get to Elsie as soon as possible. Well, that's pretty fast to me. At the bottom of the postcard, we then see it stamped again, November 19th, 1964. I don't know what kind of stamp this is, if the postcard was delayed or if it was unmailable at the Pequot Lakes, or if they're trying to figure out where Mrs. James Richmond actually lived, and then once they figured it out, they stamped it again on the 19th. I don't really know why that's on there. From a history standpoint of what was going on in that time in 1964, in February of 1964, the Beatles appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show. Sticking with that music history theme, if you look up the number one top hit on November 3rd, 1964, song was Baby Love by the Supremes. Ooh, ooh, and on November 19th, it was by J. Frankie Wilson and the Cavaliers. Song was called Last Kiss. The Lord took her away. Now you kind of get a little idea of why I do documentaries and not sing at karaoke. Being that Elsie and Lena aren't real good leads, we're going to start with Mrs. James Richmond. Just like in episode 1, when a young lady married, she would take the name of her husband. So Mrs. James Richmond would be the formal address name of James Richmond's wife. Using my favorite research resource, findagrave.com, if you search James Richmond in Minnesota, plus minus 25 years of 1964, you get 5 James Richmonds to choose from. Through process of elimination, the James Richmond that we're looking for in 1964 came to a Mr. James Leroy Richmond. Hey, thanks for sticking around. So to find Mrs. James Richmond, we first need to identify Mr. James Richmond. The husband of Mrs. James Richmond, I believe, is James Leroy Richmond. I found his memorial on findagrave.com, and he was born in 1901. Switching to my other favorite research resource, Ancestry.com, we should be able to find James Richmond in the 1910 federal census. So in the 1910 census, we could find a James Richmond living in Crow County in the village of Pequot. Being that the census is recorded as being taken in Crow County and is in Pequot Village, I see that as a pretty positive match. The postmark is from Pequot Lakes, so that's pretty close. Granted, The two are 54 years apart, so a lot can change in 54 years, but I'd take that as a start of a positive match. He's 8 years old, and he's living with his stepdad, John Me, his mother, Mary Me, his brother, John, and his stepbrother. Being that James is being raised in a step-family environment made me kind of curious as to what happened to his birth dad. So I went back to the 1900 federal census to see if I could find an answer. So in 1900, we find James' father and his mother and other siblings, Levi, Grace, and John. But we also see that Robert, James' father, also has stepchildren. At the bottom of the listing of the family, there's a Clyde Morris, a Samuel Russell, and a Maud Russell. Doing a little digging on James' father, Robert, it appears that Robert died when James was around 2 years old. So going back to the 1910 census, that means in 1910, James' mother, Mary, has been widowed 3 times. One of the other vitals that I found for James was on his headstone. He was listed as being a private in World War I. Both James and his brother Levi served during the war. James survived, but unfortunately, Levi did not. On December 4th, 1918, Levi developed diphtheria and died on the hospital ship USS Comfort. Going back to James' mother, Mary, not only was she a widow 3 times, but now she lost a son in World War I. We find James again, and he's back at home after the war, living with his stepdad and his mother and his brother. A very unusual thing I noticed in this census taking is that James is listed as being 18 years old. Being that the war was just over means that 1920 was kind of when James would have been discharged from the Army. So I looked up his service record. James Richmond enlisted in the Army August 23rd, 1917. His birthday is September 2nd, 1901. That means that James enlisted in the Army right before his 16th birthday. I know in our day and age, kids get their driver's license when they turn 16, but James was going off to fight in a war at the age of 16 years old. That's amazing. In the 1930 census, we find James again, and now he has a wife named Caroline and a son named Raymond. Looking across at James's work, he's listed as being a blacksmith for the railroad. That's kind of interesting that James is now listed as having a wife. I was hoping that Caroline might be the Mrs. James Richmond in the postcard. In 1940, we find James and his family again, and they're listed as James and his wife Sylvia, who I found out is Caroline. Caroline and Sylvia are the same person. Then there's his son Danny and his son John. Raymond is no longer listed. Doing a little research on Raymond, it turns out he passed away in 1933. Being that there's a Danny and a John now listed in the census in James's family, I was hoping that Lena might be his daughter, but it's not turning out that way. In the 1950 federal census, we find James Richmond again, except now he had a little change of events in his life, you might say. And he's living with his mother-in-law, Susan Jensen, and his new wife, Esther, and her last name is now Richmond. And then with them are Esther's two brothers, Ralph and Walter. Being that I didn't find a Lena anywhere from the Richmond censuses that I found, I think that maybe Lena is Esther's daughter and James is Lena's stepdad. From the 1950 census then, I started checking for marriage certificates prior to when the census was taken, and I found a January 3rd, 1949 marriage certificate. On the marriage certificate, it lists James Richmond marrying Esther Jensen. At the time, James was 47 and Esther was 31. At the bottom of the marriage certificate, it also says that James is divorced, and it also says that Esther is divorced. So that means that Esther, prior to James, was married to another guy, and maybe that is Lena's father. Trying to figure out who Esther Jensen's first husband was, I came up with 0 results. So using a little deductive reasoning, if Esther married James in 1949, figure that would be maybe a year to divorce her first husband, and then maybe being married and having kids. She was maybe married in 1946 and had kids Lena, in 1947. So using that guesstimation, I started searching for a Lena that was born around 1947 that was a resident of the same area, Pequot or Brainerd, Minnesota. Painstakingly searching the 1950 federal census again, I did find a man by the name of William who was separated, and he had 2 children, William and Lena. I believe William may be the man that Esther was first married to, and then she had 2 children with him, William and Lena. And Lena, in 1964, might be the grown-up daughter that's now writing to her mother, Esther Richmond. Esther Jensen, or Esther Richmond, died in 1994. So any death record of a person is public knowledge and public record, so they're accessible through the state that that person lived in. So I put in a call to the Minnesota Historical Society and bought a copy of Esther's death certificate. What I'm looking for on the death certificate is called informant information. When a person dies, usually a close relative is called an informant. It's a person that gives the information about the deceased person to a doctor when they fill out the death certificate. That person is then noted on the certificate as being the informant. So I'm hoping that Lena was the informant for her mother, and that I'll have proof of who Lena is, hopefully a last name, with her being the informant on the death certificate. Kind of taking a chance. I don't really know what I'm gonna find, but I'm hoping it'll be a clue on who Lena is. Hey, welcome back. I'm happy you could join me again. There's some interesting clues that you can learn from a death certificate. One being who the informant is, the person that gave the information when the person passed away. Another clue is who buried the body. Kind of gruesome, but if you can figure out what funeral home took care of the services and the burial, that is a helpful clue too, because then you can look at that funeral home to see if they posted any online obituaries. An obituary is kind of what we're after. Obituaries are gold mines for different descendants of the deceased and where they might be in our time. The third clue would be what the person died from. A lot of times in families, there's hereditary illness that one family member kind of generationally gets. So to know how a person died can give a clue for treatment to other family members in the future. I received Esther's death certificate from the Minnesota Historical Society, so let's see what clues the death certificate gives us. So on Esther's death certificate, the funeral home was Halverson and Johnson Funeral Home. So we can look them up online to see if they have an obituary posted for Esther. Being that Esther passed away in 1994, it's been 30 years. So a lot of times there's like a 20-year window where you can find an obituary. Unfortunately, Esther's obituary is not posted. Being that Esther isn't a blood relative, I'm not really too concerned with how she died. So the biggest clue I was looking for is who the informant was on the death certificate. In this case, I was hoping it would be Lena, but that's not the answer. The informant on Esther's death certificate was her husband James' youngest son, John. On a death certificate, it'll list the informant's home address, and kind of incredible, but John came all the way from Oregon when Esther passed away. So if John is the informant on Esther's death certificate, maybe John's wife at the time of 1964 is the one that wrote to Esther. At the time the postcard was written, John was married to a Cheryl, so maybe Cheryl went by Lena. So I'm kind of at a dead end. I don't have any more clues or any more research to do. So if you are the descendants of an Elsie, a Lena, or Esther Richmond or Esther Jensen, or are the descendants of Danny or John Richmond, I have a little postcard that you might be interested in for your family heirloom collection. Just drop me a note in the email below, and I'd be very happy to send you your family descendants postcard. Now that we kind of figured out who the people are on the back, let's switch our focus to the picture on the front. The picture on the front of the postcard is the famed Gunflint Trail sign. The sign is located in the town of Grand Marais, Minnesota. The Gunflint Trail is the road that takes you further north from Grand Marais into the wonderful wilderness of the boundary waters of northern Minnesota. In our last episode, we ended up at the University of Duluth. So now we're going to travel from Duluth up the North Shore to Grand Marais. Duluth to Grand Marais is about 110 miles and 2 hours of travel. But through the magic of YouTube, we'll just be there in a few minutes. Let's hit it! Hey, welcome back. I know there's a lot of different entertainment venues out there, and I'm really glad you could come back and spend some time with me. So if you're out there thinking, where the heck is Grand Marais, Minnesota? Let me clue you in a little bit. You first need to know country of origin, state, county, and city. First, we're in the country of the United States of America. In the United States of America, you'll find 50 states. Minnesota is one of those 50 states. In Minnesota, you'll find Cook County. In Cook County, you'll find the harbor town of Grand Marais, Minnesota. From Duluth to Grand Marais by car is about a 2-hour trip, but through the magic of YouTube, we'll just be there in a few seconds. Welcome to Grand Marais, Minnesota. This episode we're going to be staying at an Airbnb called The Lighthouse. The Lighthouse is owned and operated by Dave and Mary Miller, and it's a pretty cool place to stay because its location is real close to downtown. My wife and I really like staying in Grand Marais. We try and vacation here as often as we can. The thing we like most about it is if you stay here, you can do different day trips out into the Boundary Waters or go to different waterfalls or do a lot of hiking, things like that. And when you're done for the day, just come back, get something to eat in town, have a nice overnight stay, and then get up and go on another adventure. One of my favorite things to do, first off when we come back to town, is to go out to what's called Artist Point. Artist Point is part of the breakwaters around the harbor. On Artist Point and around the breakwaters of the harbor, you'll find a rock called basalt. Basalt is a cool hexagon-shaped rock that's formed by lava. You may have heard of basalt. There's a huge basalt deposit in Ireland. It's called Giant's Causeway. If you don't want to take the time or the expense to go to Ireland, there's a cool basalt deposit right here in Minnesota. Walking around the breakwaters, one of the things you might notice is old Coast Guard station. There is talk of maybe turning the Coast Guard station into a museum. Right now it's abandoned and not used, but it's a pretty cool old building. From the Coast Guard station, then you can start walking around the breakwater. It's a pretty cool hike. Maybe go with a hiking buddy, just in case you trip and fall and sprain an ankle or fall in the water. You got someone there to help fish you out. I usually walk alone, which isn't a real smart thing to do, but I'm kind of adventurous. A lot of times, to get a better shot, you have to jump from one rock to another. It's not the smartest thing to do when you're walking alone, but if you just have to get that just right shot, it's sometimes worth the chance. At the end of the breakwater is the lighthouse that's in the harbor. It's pretty cool. We're gonna make our way back through town, and I'll show you some of the other favorite places I like to stop. There's an art gallery in Grand Marais called the Silverton Gallery. It's a pretty cool place. I can't really show you inside because of copyrights, but you'll find that there's some pretty cool other art around town. Grand Marais hosts the Cook County Historical Society, so there is a museum that you can go check out. It's pretty cool. On my list though, there's an absolute must stop. It's called the World's Best Donuts. I'm not gonna lie, I love bakery, And World's Best Donuts is like my favorite place in the whole world. They have really good donuts, serve good coffee, all that kind of good stuff. I would definitely make that a stop if you ever decide to vacation in Grand Marais. If you can't find a coffee that you like at World's Best Donuts, you can always stop by the Java Moose. Java Moose is a real nice coffee shop in town. All kinds of great flavors. You can find anything there that would be something that you're looking for. If you'd like to follow the Java Moose, she puts out a weather report every day, which is pretty cool. You can find a link to the Java Moose if you would like to start following them on Instagram and see what the daily weather report is in Grand Marais. Looking for other adventures other than the ones I suggested, you can stop by the Cook County Visitor Center. Plus, when you find the Cook County Visitor Center, if you turn around, you'll find the Grand Marais Gunflint Trail sign. The Gunflint Trail is a 57-mile road that begins in Grand Marais and heads northwest and ends at Trails End Campground and the Chickawauk Museum and Nature Center. The beauty of the Gunflint Trail is that on the way it's surrounded on both sides by the Superior National Forest and the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness. The first resort along the Gunflint Trail was established in 1920, and since then the Boundary Waters have become a very popular destination for fishing, camping, canoeing, hiking, and other outdoor recreation. It's believed that in 1938, the 2 stone walls and 2 signs were built by the Works Progress Administration, better known as the WPA. The Works Progress Administration was an American federal agency that employed millions of job seekers to carry out public projects, including the construction of public buildings and roads during the Great Depression. For decades, these 2 signs have welcomed visitors to the Gunflint Trail and are an iconic part of the town of Grand Marais. In the early 2000s, the official entrance to the Gunflint Trail was moved to the east end of Grand Marais, but the signs were kept in place and have been mailed on countless postcards by tourists and locals alike. In 1980, my wife and her friends graduated high school, and they were like, "Hey, let's take a graduation trip." So one friend contacted the local YWCA, and the 6 of them signed on, and a total of 18 young ladies went on this canoe trip to the Boundary Waters of Minnesota. The outfitter that the YWCA booked took them on what's known as the Red Rock Alpine Seagull Loop. Boundary water camping is a little bit different than camping in a state park. On a Boundary Waters camping trip, you're given a canoe with your gear, and you have to paddle to your campsite, which is usually an island on a lake. A loop is a string of island campsites that you paddle to. Some of these loops have portages. A portage is a landmass between a water inlet and a water outlet. To navigate the portage, you have to pack up all your gear, your canoe included, and carry all your stuff on foot to the next water outlet. Then you pack all your gear back up in your canoe and paddle to the next island campsite. That might sound like a lot of work, but my wife and her friends just thought it was the greatest thing ever, and their Boundary Waters were the best place in the world ever. So my wife, because she's way cooler than I am, got together with a couple of her friends and found summer jobs
working for the canoe outfitter and lodge that ran these loop trips. My wife had such a great time, she ended up working in the Boundary Waters for 5 summers. My wife and her friend got so good at canoeing and portaging that they did the man chain loop in 2 days. My wife's favorite home away from home was the cabin she stayed in called Cabin Number 5. Unfortunately, Cabin Number 5 was destroyed by a forest fire, we believe in 2007. But my wife still has the paddle key fob for Cabin Number 5 hanging from her rearview mirror in her truck. And sometimes, if you're quiet, you can still hear the loons on the lake calling to each other at sunset.
Each time we visit, we take a drive up the Gunflint Trail.
At the end of the Gunflint Trail, you'll find the Chickawauk Museum and Nature Center. The Chickawauk Museum and Nature Center is pretty cool because in the museum you can learn all about the history of how the Gunflint Trail came to be and learn about all the canoe outfitters and lodges that operated on the trail since the 1920s. Along with learning about the owners, you can also find pictures of the crews that worked alongside them. If you look for her, you'll find my wife pictured with her crew during her time in the Boundary Waters.
I'm very proud of my wife and the work ethic that she developed while working in the Boundary Waters.
And it's going to be pretty fun taking our descendants to Chickawauk someday to see if they can find their grandma in the pictures here. If you're a past alumni of a crew that worked in the Boundary Waters, you might want to pay the Chickawauk Museum a visit, maybe with your family, and share your stories with them.
This concludes this edition of the Postcard Pilgrim, Episode 6, The Sign. If you enjoyed this show so far, please hit the like and subscribe button for future episodes. If you love this show like I know some of you do, you can show some love back and give a donation to my favorite charity, the Sussex Area Outreach Services. Please follow the link below in the comments if you would like to find out how you can make a donation. Thank you in advance if you do make a donation, and as always, take care and God bless. Until next time.